Hi guys, Ross here and welcome back to another video. So where have I been? I haven't posted in about 4 months. Well, I went freelance at the end of last year and I've just been flat out ever since. So it is that same old story of I've been too busy to post, but that really is the case. You know, life kind of just gets in the way. I've been busy chasing that money, but I'm back and I'm back with a banging video. Today, we're going to be talking about how you can light your interior scenes using Cinema 4D and Redshift. There's not too many videos out there on the World Wide Web that I could find anyway on how to do this using Redshift, or not any tutorials I thought were any good, but I'm here with a good one, I hope. So today we're going to be talking about how you can push beyond just using a HDRI, because that seems to be the common kind of approach to making these interior/exterior scenes. But we're going to be talking about how we can push beyond that, introducing area lights to kind of art direct our scenes, and just make them a bit more stylized and get the results we want. Just have a nice professional finish to our work. Here you can see me just modeling the what's the word I'm looking for? The scene. I'm modeling the scene here. I've sped it up because it's nothing too interesting. Just set up a cube pretty much with a window which I'm building out of cubes again, and then using a Boolean tool to just cut it out the side, and then applying a glass material to turn it into a window. So that's basically the setup for that. I thought I'd speed through that because it's nothing too crazy. So yeah, I'm going to stop waffling now and actually dive into how to light this scene. If you find the video useful, you know what to do. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell so you know when I next upload, whenever that is. And yeah, that's it. Alright, thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace. Okay, so this is our scene setup. I'm going to dive out of the camera so you can see what's going on. Basically, it's just a box setup made of planes. I don't know why I didn't use a cube, but yeah, it's made of planes. And then I've used a Boolean tool to cut out 3 windows here with just some nice kind of borders here to create some nice shadows further down the line. I've then applied a simple off-white material, and here's a super quick tip. Get your pens out, get your notepad out. This is the first tip of the video. Never use a full 100% material. I don't care what it is. Nothing in real life is 100% white. So you never want to push this all the way up to 100%, because when you start to add your lights in, even without any lights. Now I'm using aces, so it's not going to be as prominent. But if I was to turn this to sRGB, look how blown out that is on the back wall there. So you never want to use 100% white. Always bring it down, probably 90% at maximum, but I'm going 85 just to be safe, because you know, better safe than sorry. I'm then injecting a little bit of warmth by just putting like 3% saturation with a hue of 25, so just gives it a little bit of warmth, which is going to lend itself to our lighting. I then have a simple glass material, which is just a preset glass. Slap that onto the windows and job's a good one. So I've decided to set this tutorial up a little bit different. Basically, I've already built the lighting and I'm just going to run through each of the lights one by one. Because I recorded this already. This is like the 3rd or 4th time I've recorded this, and it was way too long. So we're going to just do it this way. So I'm going to go into the camera and I'm just going to lock it in the render view here. Just get rid of those settings. So now I can come out of the camera and it's going to stay in place on the render view. So let's turn on our HDR. So let's just hit the tick button, and you can see straight away in our render view, I'm not using a HDR which is giving us really nice, you know, contrasting light. It's not giving us that really nice light you see when it casts through windows. It's giving us a very soft, diffused lighting. The most common way people approach their HDRI lighting is they kind of use that as their key light. So they're using that to get all the really nice lights, all the really nice shadows and reflections. Basically just trying to do it all in that one object, which is cool if you can pull it off. But we want to just take it to that next level. We want to have a bit more control over our scene, and that's what this video is talking about. So I'm using a HDR from PG Skies, which I believe I've got open here. That's my Twitter. If you're not following me, go follow me, man. Come on, I'm active on there a little bit. I'm using 1855 Dusk. So you can see just from the preview that, you know, we're not really getting any insane shadows. It's very, very soft. Even this doesn't really show anything of any interest compared to if we find something like 1934, where we're getting these really nice kind of shadows on this wall. So we're using a very, very soft HDR, but what I want you to pay attention to is you see we have this shifting color on the wall. So we've got this blue wall here, but then it's fading to like a warmer color here. And that's because if we look at the little preview in the bottom right here, we have a really nice shift between like a reddish from where the sun is to a blue sky. So we're getting that contrast in color. Now, here's quick tip number 2. When setting up your lighting, even though it's very, very minuscule, you do want to create some sort of contrast in color between warm and cooler hues. So you'll see as we go further into this kind of setup, I start to shift the colors of the different lights to get that contrast. Now, it's a very minute detail, but when you come to a finished piece, those tiny little details are all going to add up and add more depth to your piece and add more visual interest. So you can already see how that actually looks quite nice. Even though we're not getting any kind of really dynamic and interesting lighting, that splitting color does give us quite an interesting look. So that is the start of our kind of setup, and you can see I've cranked up the exposure because by default an exposure of 0, which is the default a HDR would be when you put a light down. And by the way, if you really don't know how to set up a HDR or anything, just grab a dome light from your Redshift toolbar, go to your path and just drop in a HDR file. If you don't want to pay for a HDR, because this one is paid, it's 15 quid, you can use something like HDRI Haven or HDR Skies. They're both really good free alternatives, which I pretty much use, to be honest, for most of my work. It's just for this one, I kind of wanted to dive a little bit deeper. So yeah, go online, check them out, just figure out what works for you. This is just one HDR. But like I said, I've cranked this up to 4.5. So this is already given us quite a nice illumination for this room, but it's very, very basic still. I then also reduced the saturation a little bit because I want to use my area lights to paint more color into here. I don't want too much color coming from the HDR. So I have just knocked it back to 80% saturation. All the other settings are exactly the same, so we don't need to worry about them too much, but this is our starting point. So I'm going to just make sure that's locked to the camera, and I'm going to dive out. And let's start looking through these area lights. So I actually want to start off with this fill light here. So if I just turn off the HDR, because I like to solo my lights out one by one, that way I can really focus on what each one's doing. And sometimes by doing that, you'll realize, you know what, I can probably bin off this light because it's not doing anything and it's just overcomplicating the scene. So let's turn on this fill light. And you can see we're using this to cast some more light on the floor here and on the back wall. So we're starting to add that more interesting lighting you get from these window scenes, which you see online all the time. And what we're actually doing to get these soft results, because like the example we saw a minute ago with the HDR, it had a very sharp result like this one here. We're getting a much softer result, and that's because we're using a larger light. If you look at how far away this light is compared to the actual building, it's quite far away, and that's giving us softer results. If we were to move it like a bit closer, you can see it's given us a bit of a harsher result, and it's also a lot more intense, whereas if we move it further away, it's a lot more diffused. The lighting's a lot more even throughout, which is kind of lending itself to the soft HDR we have going on. So we're trying to blend all the lighting together. Now, that is one disadvantage of this way of working. You do have to work harder for these area lights to blend together with the HDRs or with each other in order to still achieve a realistic result, but we do have more control over the scene. So if we now combine this with our HDR, we now have that additional light along the bottom, along the back wall, just a bit more injection of brightness into our scene, which we weren't getting from the HDR alone. Like I mentioned with the HDR, I have injected a little bit of color into this area light, and like I said, it has to be very minute. You can see I've only added 4% saturation, and then I've changed it to this kind of coolish hue here. So if I was to turn this down to 0%, if my keyboard decides to work, you can see we're now going back to that original kind of warm tone we have on our wall materials. So by just putting in like 4% hue, I need to just undo that because it's, there we go. By just putting 4% on a cool hue, we're just injecting a little bit more detail into the piece and just adding another layer to it. I've then reduced the intensity down to 40 and then the exposure to -2 because we want this to be quite a subtle light, and we are layering it on top of the HDR, which is already quite bright, and then we're going to be layering in that with other area lights as well. So at this point we're keeping it quite subtle. We can always go back and tweak these settings if we need to. So that's our fill light. I'm then going to move on to another fill light. I actually haven't renamed these area lights, so they make no sense. But this one is now projecting that really nice light onto the back wall. So let's have a look at how this is set up. So this is facing the building at more of an angle, and it's closer, it's smaller, so we're getting slightly harsher results. And what I've also done is I've turned down the spread on this as well. So if I was to turn this all the way up to 1, first of all, it's going to be a lot darker, but it's going to be a lot more diffused. We're able to get slightly sharper results by turning the spread down. The best way I can describe the way spread works is, well, if I cranked it all the way down and like moved it in line of sight, you can see we now have a much harsher result. Probably push it down even more. There we go. So now we got really harsh light here, which is going to allow us to capture the silhouette of the borders on the window, but it does make the light a lot brighter. So you will have to then drop down the exposure. So I'm just going to undo all of that. So now we're back in position, I believe. Yep, cool. And with this one, I've actually made it warm. So I've turned the hue to 25 and a saturation to 7. So if we now combine that with the previous fill light, we have that cool tone along the floor. And then we now have this new warmer light hitting that back wall, adding that extra layer of detail to the piece. So we're getting that really nice light that you would get, or you would expect from like a sunset, I suppose. But we're just controlling it through individual area lights instead of just using one HDR. So if we now turn on that original HDR, you can see we're starting to lose a little bit of the kind of detail from those lights, but that is how it would react in real life. Another quick tip, I think this is the third one. The window should always be the brightest area of your scene. If you just look at a window in real life, or you look at photographs of interiors, the window is always the brightest area, and that's because the sun is pretty much the brightest element on Earth. If you study photographs, you'll see how the window is always slightly blown out, and we can achieve that through post effects like bloom and streak. But you can already see how the window is the brightest area of this render. And that is something you do want to keep in mind. You don't want the window to be darker than any other area in the scene, because then it's just going to look unrealistic. Like, even if the rest of the scene looks really good, our brains just know that the window is always the brightest source. So just another quick tip, that's the third one. God, this tutorial is packed full of goodness. But you can see now that the kind of render view has denoised it a little bit, that those lights are working really well. They're very subtle, they're just nice kind of soft lights on the floor and on the back wall, and we are getting a nice shift between those cooler and those warmer tones because we have dialed in that kind of detail into the area lights. So just as a reminder, our big light up here has a slightly cooler tone, whilst our smaller light down here, which is projecting this light onto the back wall, has a slightly warmer tone. So we're getting that nice split in color, which is helping to add a bit more detail to our piece. So the final light, I know we're nearly there already, simple as that really. The final light is this super small light down here, so I'm going to turn them all off. Like I said, I like to solo my lights out. This small light here, so I'm actually just going to hide the others so I can kind of show you clearer what's going on. That's definitely not supposed to happen. There we go. Okay, so this is a super small light. You can see it's tiny. It's got a crazy intensity multiplier of 1,000, and that's to compensate for how small this area light is, because if I was to leave it at 100, which is the default, look how dark that is. If I was to turn on all the other lights right now, that would not even make a scrap of difference. Like, you can see maybe it's a little bit warmer, you can see it very, very slightly, but compare it to when I put it up to 1000 intensity multiplier, that becomes a really prominent light source in our scene, which just helps to add that extra level of detail. And look how nice that looks with all the area lights on. I promise you, if we were to just use a HDR, not only would we have less control over how sharp, how diffused all the lights are, but we're not going to get as a buttery smooth result as what we've got right here. And we're not able to dial in those differences in colors. We're just missing out on a lot of detail which we can dial in using these area lights. Now, there's going to be people that tell me, and you know, it is true to a sense, that this isn't the correct way of lighting your scene. You should stick to trying to do it as physically accurate as possible, but this is CG, this is 3D, right? We're in a whole different realm right now. This isn't real life. We can stylize it as much as we want. We can break the rules. We can use whatever techniques we need to use to get the job done. And this is a technique which I think works great. Now, the example I put on my story, which maybe I'll put on the video, it was quite a big scene, and using just a HDR wasn't giving me the result I needed. It wasn't filling the room. So adding these extra area lights really helped me to get the illumination I needed. And you can see just from using these area lights, we've got a really nicely lit room. If I was to go back to the HDR, like, it's a pretty bright HDR, don't get me wrong, but it just looks really flat. Like, if we had a really contrasted HDR, it probably still would give a bit of fall off in the corners. It wouldn't be evenly lit, whereas we have that really nice base with the HDR, which has given us quite an even lighting throughout, and then we're able to dial in that interesting lighting through the area lights. So I went off on a bit of a tangent there, but back to this small light here. We've got a 1000 multiplier. Again, we're keeping this quite warm because we want it to match the softer light which we have on the back wall, which also has this warm tone to it, because we kind of want these two to blend together, because basically what this softer one is doing here is helping to kind of diffuse this harsher one. So if we were to turn that off, we now have this quite harsh result, whereas when we turn this on, we have a bit more spill around the edges of that light source. And then when we combine that with the fill light on the floor, we just get a really nice soft dreamy look. And you can see that contrast between that warm and that cool. Mix it with a HDR, boom, we got a really nice soft dreamy light setup. So the finishing touches for this scene would be to kind of go into post effects here, and like I said, if you look at photographs of a window, it's going to be all kind of like blown out. It's going to look like it's glowing almost because of how bright the sun is. So we can use something called bloom, which you can't really see too much, but if I was to like crank out the intensity like all the way, you can see how it's affecting that window, and it's kind of adding a little bit of glow to it. And we can turn down the threshold, and you can see how that determines how bright an area needs to be before it's affected by the bloom. So I wanted it just to affect the window, because if I go too low, it starts to affect the light on the back wall. So I don't think I can undo this. So let's just get that right. So that's a super subtle effect just to kind of add an extra level of detail. And then we can combine this with a streak, which again, super subtle, but just helps to add a little bit more glow to it. You can see it kind of at the bottom of the window, starts to blow it out a little bit. And we can turn down the threshold so it kind of like captures the edges. And I'll just turn that on and off to make sure it's not affecting anything else. It looks like it's all good. And then we can turn on our photographic exposure. So now you can see that bloom and that streak is really apparent. So I'm just going to turn that down. There we go. It doesn't need to be anything crazy. So the photographic exposure can be controlled through the camera. So if we go to our Redshift camera tag, go to exposure and then enable it. And basically this now takes into account like actual camera settings. So I could decrease the shutter time ratio, and that's going to brighten the image, or I could increase it back to 200. It's going to darken it, because that basically is how much light the camera is letting into the sensor. We then have the f-stop, which is to do with aperture, which is important when you're using depth of field. Probably not as much in Redshift because you have the bokeh tab for that, but you can basically affect how much light is coming in through using this as well. And then we have allowed overexposure. Now this is actually really handy, because if I crank this up to 1, you can see The back wall is super bright, so is the window. Basically, this is going to tone down how bright or how overexposed your image can get. So I like to set this like 0.2, 0.3. You don't want to go too low because then you're not going to get any whites at all. It's going to be a very flat image like you can see here. If I just kind of uncheck it and check it, you can see it takes out all the contrast of the image, which is not what we want. So I'm going to crank that back up to 0.3, which will give us those lovely glowing window. And I think that's pretty much it. The settings I've got in terms of render settings are basically brute force for the primary, irradiance point cloud for the secondary, 4 GI bounces just to add a little bit more GI in there. And then I usually, for like Instagram renders in particular, just put automatic sampling on. I'm always getting people asking me, what are my render settings? Mate, just bang on automatic sampling, turn on your GI, and you're pretty much good to go. Maybe bump up the reflection and the refraction if you need to. I probably don't even need to for this one. I could probably 6, 6, 6. Simple as that. Maybe put that up to like 12. And yeah, jobs are good. So hopefully you guys find this video helpful, and hopefully it encourages you to go beyond just using a HDR in your images. Start to branch out, use area lights, play with different color tones, different scales, different intensities, different spreads. All these different parameters and settings you can play with to completely change the look of your renders and just add an extra level of detail to your pieces of work. So if you did find this video helpful, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell so you know when I next upload, but that could be whenever, knowing me. And I think that is it. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. I'm always around to help out if need be. And follow me on Instagram, follow me on Twitter. That's where I'm most active. I actually do post quite a bit on those. And yeah, I will catch you in the next video. All right, thanks for watching, guys. Catch you in a bit. Peace.